Greetings, faithful brothers and sisters in the Lord. In this incredibly candid and unexpected interview, Johnathan and his wife Suzy talked candidly about their financial situation, their decisions, and how leaving Daystar and all that went along with it has significantly impacted their lives. Let me tell you, this is not what most people expected. Let's start with the interviewer's statement because it sets the tone for the entire conversation. Instead of dismissing the idea, Johnathan and Suzy opened up, and what they said may actually shock a lot of people. You gave up the money, you gave up the celebrity, and it hits differently when you realize how many people thought they were just sitting comfortably on millions. Johnathan revealed that he received a significant pay increase in 2022 while he was vice president of Daystar. So sure, it came with a respectable salary. But here's the really bad news. Prior to that, their lives appeared completely normal. They even described their lifestyle as normal and mediocre, not in a negative way, in a very grounded and humble way. Suzy added that she was making less than what a Starbucks barista makes, but she wasn't complaining, explaining that she was primarily a full-time mother and that it was okay because that's how many families live in real life, budgeting and making the most of what they have. They lived in a $200,000 house for 8 years. It's not a mansion or a private compound, and now they're not settled in life. They still have a mortgage to pay and bills to pay, just like the rest of us. In fact, the interviewer even said that if things don't change, they might have to sell their house. That's how bad things have gotten for them. Demonstrates how simple it is for people to make assumptions about someone with a large ministry like Daystar. The public begins to picture private jets, vacation homes, and millions of dollars hidden in a secret bank account. But this interview revealed the human side of that story. Johnathan and Suzy left behind more than just money. They left behind security, stability, and a way of life that requires courage, faith, which also indicates that they aren't motivated by status symbols or money signs. Therefore, when people say they gave up everything, this conversation demonstrates that it wasn't just a dramatic statement. It was true that they left a platform and income from a future that was essentially set for them in favor of something more difficult, less glamorous, and something they felt was right. It also makes you consider how we evaluate people when we see their last name or title in the public light, or a connection, and we make snap judgments, but we don't always know the specifics or the sacrifices made behind the scenes. And it's obvious that Johnathan and Suzy have made some significant ones. Despite everything, what really stood out in this conversation wasn't just the financial discussion, it was their candor. They weren't defensive, they weren't trying to sugarcoat things, and they were just open, which is refreshing, especially at a time when so many carninas arroz. Here's the takeaway. Public personalities and leaders frequently avoid the truth or give evasive responses. Let's move on to the video, because Johnathan Lamb and his wife Suzy aren't living some millionaire fantasy. Rather, they are living a true story about faith, sacrifice, and choices. Whether you agree with them or not, you have to respect the bravery required to forego comfort for the sake of morality. I mean, it was the wrestling and breaking of me pleading with God when Johnathan would be ready, so I'm ready to sell this house, and I'm ready for a new beginning. We have 50 states to choose from, and we lay everything on the altar for the truth, if we had at that time. To head, when he passed away and I got a really nice salary, and Johnathan too, you would think that would be the time to be tempted to stay, if anything. We would have had everything my father had stated in writing, that I would be the next president after my mother retired or died, if we had just gone along with the charade, set aside our beliefs, read the card, and continued to not question anything about Pete. Sometimes the most important decisions in life aren't about choosing between right and wrong, but rather between what's easy and what's right, and that's exactly what happened. What Johnathan and Suzy Lamb discussed in this podcast interview wasn't just emotional, it was also very real. Let's start with Suzy's remarks because they were very moving. She talked about how her father-in-law's death in 2022 changed their family's course, and most people would think that this would be the time they stay and dig in, because after all the suffering they finally felt at ease because they were at last receiving high pay. Suzy even mentioned that she received a very good salary after Johnathan was appointed vice president. Financially, it was the best time ever, and for most people, let's face it, that would be an excuse to stay. Why would you leave when the money is good, you have security, and you're finally feeling set? However, Suzy's heart was elsewhere, and she claimed that this was actually the time when she was most all set to depart. I'm ready to sell this house. I'm ready for a new beginning. That's not just courage, that's faith in action. Then she said, pleading with God for a way out when things were finally stable on the outside. This was not because she wanted to avoid responsibility, but rather because she wanted to live with integrity and walk in truth, even if it meant starting over. Wow, Johnathan really put everything out when he said that the most powerful part of his statement was, "We lay everything on the altar for the truth." Let that sink in. He meant that they were willing to give up everything, money, house, title, inheritance, fame, comfort, in order to stand for what they believed in. They literally had 50 states to choose from, and they were serious about leaving their current situation and starting over anywhere in the nation. What was appropriate, because they would have had it all if they had taken the simple route, followed the charade as he described it, and simply grinned, remained silent, and backed judgments they didn't agree with. Johnathan clarified that he was virtually certain of becoming the future president of Daystar if they had remained silent and pretended that everything was good with his mother's remarriage and leadership. He said that the position was set up in paper. He walked away as though he had an inheritance waiting to be passed down, but he and Suzy did so not because they were pushed out, but rather because they chose truth over tradition, integrity over influence, conviction over comfort. Let's face it, most people today would have simply smiled and remained silent if they had been offered that kind of leadership, that kind of salary, and that kind of legacy. Listening to them talk, you could tell they were at peace about it. Not the fake kind of peace you get from ignoring problems, but the real kind that comes from knowing you did the right thing even when it was the difficult thing. This part of the podcast really pulls back the curtain and demonstrates that the Lambs weren't just making a dramatic statement. They couldn't do it because their hearts wouldn't let them. And yes, it cost them a lot of money, and emotionally. Here's the real takeaway. They were praying and deeply considering their options, and even though it didn't make sense on the surface, or if it meant losing a lot, they were prepared to give up the world's definition of success in order to maintain their integrity, faith, and values, something you don't see every day. There are moments when doing the right thing is lonely and not always received with praise. Although it's expensive, it's ultimately worthwhile, and Johnathan and Suzy demonstrated in this podcast that standing up for the truth is worthwhile even if it means giving up everything else to be in it.